Ever since their son was murdered in Syria last summer, the parents of Jim Foley have been critical of the government's role, saying officials did not do enough to help and find and rescue him. Now, Diane and John Foley are criticizing the media, too. When news first broke that Global Post correspondent Jim Foley had been abducted in Syria, it was major news.
And a New Hampshire man who spent 44 days in captivity in Libya 2 years ago is missing again tonight.
Part of that coverage touched on the difficult question of paying ransom. U.S. policy forbids it, a policy supported by Global Post executive Phil Balboni.
It was Global Post policy as well. The family made a decision that they wanted to pay a ransom, and they were hard at work raising the money to pay a ransom.
There were back-channel efforts to secure Foley's release, including a failed government rescue. Jim Foley was beheaded last August. Since then, John and Diane have been critical of the government.
We didn't feel Jim was a priority, even though we were told that from the very beginning that he was.
And speaking at the University of Arizona this week, John Foley said part of the blame lies with the media for letting it fall out of the news cycle. You know, I'm not going to be critical of these parents because they lost their son, and this was a really, really painful. I mean, they did everything they could, and I know Phil Balboni was also very well involved in this, but to be critical of the news media, I mean, there's a lot of criticism that the news media is self-absorbed as it is, that we only care about our own, that we only report on our own. And I went back and looked. Jim Foley got one hell of a lot of news coverage. Locally, a tremendous amount, because he was from New Hampshire and he worked for Global Post, which is based in Boston. Even our show, Greater Boston and Beat the Press, did it 10 times in the times that he was. That's a lot in a news cycle, and I think that the Foley should know that. As for the government's role, I mean, you know, they kept him as clued in as they could, and they don't accept ransom. They don't accept negotiations, and you know, there was a lot more going on than met the eye there.
Yeah, I mean, I think we might be better off if other governments weren't paying ransoms.
That's the problem.
Than if our government was paying ransoms. You know, I mean, I disagree with the Foleys. I can't criticize them. This is the worst thing, anything that could ever happen to parents, and you know, my heart just goes out to them.
No, and it's clear that people from Global Post, all of them, were just completely distressed, doing everything they could within the parameters that they had. I mean, people did care. It's just a terrible tragedy.
It's kind of it's a helpless situation on all sides. You know, from the beginning, because foreign correspondents risk so much to do this job, and you know, we all know people that do this. They're a certain breed of person. They're willing to risk their lives for these stories. They take on those risks, and unfortunately, the families don't, and that's the hard thing to accept, and that's what you see in these situations.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, these people have my deepest sympathy. I'm sorry to channel Scott Walker, but I'm going to punt on this one.
Well, I don't want to be critical of them and the way they feel, but I agree with Dan just by saying that they're wrong about that. You know, you can't impose your will on the news media. I mean, we all know. You know, it's hard enough getting anything, you know, with any kind of, you know, balance or even, but something like that once it enters the news cycle, it's going to come around. It's going to come around, but it's not going to be in the news every single day. You know, we'll reserve that to some more ridiculous things.